Okay, there we go. So I'll start again. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you to HSBC, and thank you to Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. You're both outstanding leaders on this subject, and it's a real pleasure, privilege to be with you and to try to talk through and share ideas on how we take this forward. And I hope it is genuinely sharing ideas. I'll do my best to leave some time to interact. I'm going to give a version of the report which, because of where we are, has a strong cities and China take on. The report is about the world as a whole, but I thought we might concentrate on cities in China because of where we are. And I hope in the discussion, and I believe that will happen in the discussion, we can look forward particularly to what the financial sector can contribute. Because one thing that's becoming increasingly clear, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, is just what a powerful effect the financial sector can have, and actually what a powerful effect that the financial sector is beginning to have in this area. So I hope that right at the end I'll add a little bit to the slides which focus a bit on the finance. And I'll add one footnote to the introduction. I am a member of the House of Lords, but I'm a cross-party member of the... I hope I'm not being controversial in saying that amongst many of us, the current health of the British political system is not particularly encouraging. So to be a non-party member of the House of Lords is particularly important at this time. So we're doing our best, but it's hard. Now, but just to pursue that aside just for one moment longer, it is actually quite remarkable during turbulent times in the UK how the cross-party commitment to this issue has been maintained. Now, we're the 10th anniversary of the Climate Change Act, and it's been celebrated across the political spectrum. I won't say it's universal across the whole of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and I can name you 3 or 4 members of the House of Lords who do not take this sufficiently seriously, but they are the minority. They're the sort of out on a limb. I mean, we'll saw the limb off over time, but it is something that stayed across government in the UK, and that's actually a very important point, is that if we're to proceed, this shouldn't be too political. Some of it will inevitably, the laws of physics are not a political story. They're laws of physics. So that's just a little underlining in relation to something that I will be coming back to. So I am going to take, as I've said, a cities and China and also a finance view. I want to start with how important it is to move quickly. Because people say, well, look, I understand the problem, but don't these effects come through down the road? Well, they do come through down the road. I mean, some of them coming through already, of course, but the very big ones come through down the road, so we'll deal with it as time goes by. But actually, this is intensely urgent, and the urgency and scale of what we have to do is something that is not sufficiently understood, even if people appreciate the problem. Then I'll link it up, as others have already said, with the growth story, because this is the growth story of the 21st century, the inclusive growth story of the 21st century. It is an extraordinary investment, innovation, business opportunity, and this is exactly the kind of community that is beginning to lead the charge. Cities are, of course, absolutely vital, so I will, given where we are, focus there. Sustainable infrastructure and cities will be in large measure where all this is decided, and so it is important to go there. China, of course, by far now the biggest emitter, and how China changes, how China leads, and China is beginning to lead on, actually it's gone beyond the beginning, and China is leading force on all this now, and that's extremely important. China's been a little hesitant about how it moves to a leadership position in the world. This dimension, it seems to me, of fundamental importance in China expressing itself as the world leader, which it is. So that's the story. Now, what is actually happening? And this is, you can see that the world is decelerating. That this issue has got into public discussion, and it is decelerating, but not everywhere. And China is roughly flat. China's at a plateau at the minute, and it's on a plateau with some bumps in it. And it's going to bump along. It's a slight tick up this last year or so. But I genuinely think that China's in a plateau. And I came here via Singapore and the New Economy Forum. But on Monday, I was working in China with the NDRC on some initial discussions around the next stages of reform. Of course, within that, the 14th five-year plan. I think it's absolutely fundamental that China turns down its emissions during the 14th five-year plan period. Ideally, that 2021, 2025. Ideally, as close to the beginning of that five-year period as possible. China's so big in the world, if China doesn't turn down, the world doesn't turn down. And we're going to see in just a moment, you know already, for those of you, and many of you who participate, that the world has to turn down very soon if we're to have any reasonable chance of holding to the Paris Agreement. And through this talk, I'll be taking the ambition as the Paris ambition, which is well below 2 degrees, 1.5 if you can, but well below 2 degrees. So I won't repeat that all the time. That runs through what I say. And when I talk about the Paris targets, that's what I'm highlighting. The USA is turning down, notwithstanding the current occupant of the White House. And why? Because one of the great joys about the USA is there's so many different bits to it. And you've got the states and the cities and the firms. And many of those are just getting on with it. They're getting on with it for two reasons. One is it's the right thing to do. And the second is this is the growth story of the 21st century. And more people across the world, including in the United States, and indeed with quite a lot of leadership in the United States, are just getting on with it. Mike Bloomberg is probably running for president, so he understands it, and we'll see what happens next. But I couldn't possibly comment on US politics. Now, this is what we have to do. We have to essentially go net zero in 50 years. I mean, 50 years may be an outside, but we have to go net zero in 50 years to hit the Paris targets. 1.5, we actually have to go net zero in around 30 years. I mean, soon, right? Net zero sounds to some, oh, that's a bit ambitious, can't we sort of go down a bit? No, I mean, all the while that emissions are above net zero, concentrations are rising. If concentrations are rising, temperature is rising. If you want to stabilize temperature, you've got to go to net zero. If, God forbid, we stabilize it at 4 degrees, I mean, we would have been, many of us, and many of our children would have been gone if that happened. But even if you stabilized at 4 degrees, it's got to be net zero. Because if it's not net zero, if it's above, you're adding to the concentrations. It's the concentrations that capture the infrared and stop it escaping that give you the warming. So all the while you're above net zero, concentrations rising, temperature rising. So the question becomes then, what is your target? If your target is the Paris target, then you've got to get to net zero in about 50. And then if it's the 1.5 target, you've got to get to net zero in about 30. So that's why we draw these curves the way we draw them. I mean, it's a very simple argument, really. And, but it isn't sufficiently understood how strongly we have to act, how quickly, if we're to avoid these terrible dangers. Another way of looking at the story of urgency is looking at the overall emissions that the atmosphere can take before you start breaching levels of concentrations which take you beyond the 2 degree or well below 2 degree cutoff. And essentially that is a pie chart that's saying, well, had we looked forward in 1870 and understood this problem, of course we didn't, but had we looked forward in 1870 and understood this problem, we'd have realized that we've only got just below 3,000 gigatons of CO2. Giga is, I mean, in the financial world we use billion and the scientists like giga, but it's the same thing. So we'd have left then about 800. We're emitting CO2, of course the other greenhouse gas is add on top, but we're emitting CO2 around 35 ballpark per annum. Yeah? Well, that says that if we emit on the scale that we're doing at the moment, well, we don't have much more than 25 years or so at that level. And of course, we're still rising. So it's just another take. And that would be then we'd have to stop completely, well, you can't stop on a sixpence, as it were. But that's another measure of how fast we have to change. And the delay, I'll come to the growth side of the story to get another picture of the urgency, but delay means not simply that you've stocked up more emissions and pushed them into the concentration, so increased the global warming effect, but delay means more than that. Delay means locking in long-lived high-carbon assets. So you don't simply, by delaying, as it were, postpone grappling with the problem, you make it much worse in two senses. You've ramped up the concentrations in the atmosphere, and you've locked in assets which are going to be emitting in the future. So the dangers of delay are really intense. And a reaction sometimes, and I'll go into the growth theory in just a moment, but sometimes you hear the reaction on the dangers of delay by saying, well, yeah, I do understand the dangers of delay, but you have to realize, and there's a lot of change, and can we get this change done in time? Why don't we take it a bit more gently? But that's saying implicitly that actually, well, 3 degrees is sort of okay. President Putin once remarked that another 2 degrees in Moscow in February sounds like a good idea, but a 3-degree world would be devastating. I mean, a 4-degree world is almost 5 degree, which could happen, is terrifying. But we haven't been at 3 degrees for around 3 million years. Our civilization is really since the last ice age, when we started maybe 10,000 years ago, and perhaps a bit closer to our time than that, we started to turn the grasses into grains, and so we had to sit down, because that meant after planting we had to wait for the harvest, we had to look after it, and that meant because we had grains we could store, we didn't have to go out gathering or hunting every day, and we had surplus, so we could have university teachers and bankers and things. So that's the time of our civilization. And it's a few thousand years, generously several thousand years, but since the last ice age. Homo sapiens is 250,000, most of that as hunter and gatherer. We haven't seen 3 degrees for 3 million years. It's way outside the experience. And hundreds of millions, and I think you were looking at some of these problems in the conference you just had, hundreds of millions would probably have to move, perhaps billions, and if we've learned anything from history, that takes you to serious and very extensive conflict, the reasons for which could not be turned off if they would continue. You know, you don't make a peace treaty with the environment after you've made a big mess of it. So I think it's very important when you make that case on urgency, just to remind that if you say, well then, the changes are a bit big, let's take a bit more time, you're saying something that's very unpleasant, very dangerous. It sounds, oh, let's relax a bit, but it's not. It's actually taking us into very dangerous territory. Now, I'll give you, I've got some worrying, anxious themes. I've shared some of those with you, but there's some positive things. Basically, if you look back, I mean, just the dozen years or so since we published the Stern Review, it's almost exactly 12 years ago now, that was a year before the iPhone came out. Yeah? If you think, now, at that time, if you'd asked me 12 years ago, would all the major car companies be talking about the end of the era of the internal combustion engine? You would not have thought that. So there was no iPhone, you couldn't conceive of Uber and the much more effective, efficient usage of capital. You couldn't conceive of the Internet of Things and how we can run electricity systems much better. So if you think about organizing energy systems, if you think about transport, if you think about electricity, now many parts of the world, solar and wind, with storage, are competing without a carbon price. I mean, shame on us, but competing without a carbon price and without subsidy with traditional fossil fuels. And whilst there will be some technical progress along fossil fuels, the technical progress in these renewable areas is still very rapid and very rapid in storage too. So they're going on down. And actually you can put up a solar plant in a year or so. It'd take you 4 or 5 years to put up a coal plant. So you should actually be, these things are already competitive, but you should actually be comparing the solar plant cost and the coal plant costs with where the solar plant costs will be 4 or 5 years from now. And that's even for current investments. So essentially that the change in technology has been absolutely remarkable in power and in transport and increasingly in some of the hard to tackle sectors like steel and cement. It's changing, and it's changing very quickly. There are lots of other things in the buildings and the forests which I won't go into, but you really do have an enormous increase in our ability to make things happen. So this is the story of the it is the growth story of the 21st century. The innovation is quite remarkable. We're seeing in the great Austrian American economic historian Schumpeter spoke about how innovation happens and how it drives growth. And that's what we're seeing. And the kind of infrastructure we're talking about boosts demand in the short to medium term. It sharpens up supply. You're seeing this Schumpeterian story in the medium run of innovation and discovery driving investment and growth. And in the long run, there is no high carbon growth story. It's just not an option. It creates an environment so hostile that it will undermine, set back, destroy growth and destroy the achievements that we made over the last 70 years or so. So this is the growth story. It's the growth story. I mean, it's a definite article, not the indefinite article. It's the growth story of the 21st century. And if you look at how it works and the inclusion, I mean, public transport and clean air benefit poor people particularly. They use that to get to work. It's the poorer people who suffer much. Where they are and how they move about, pollution is much worse for them. So this is an inclusive growth story in terms of the public transport and the pollution. It's an inclusive growth story if you think of decentralized solar and the very large hundreds of millions of people without access to power. Now, decentralized solar is a very strong way of bringing people off-grid into the system. So this is not only the growth story, it's the inclusive growth story. But the next, I've already argued in terms of the science and what we have to do, these that we have to turn down and bring down very quickly. But if you think about the relationship between the economics and the science now, the world economy will double in 20 years. Yeah? I mean, that's just a 3.1, 3.2% growth rate. And that's ballpark. For this argument, it doesn't matter whether the world economy doubles in 18 or 25. You can see the point I'm making. If the world economy is going to double in 20 years or so, and you have to bring down in that time emissions by 25 or 30%, you can see how strong the change has to be. If this new economy that we construct, side by side with the one we've got, looks anything like it, it will be increasing by 50, 60%, not reducing by 25 or 30%. So you can see how fast we have to change. And whilst I've told this very optimistic story about what a good world it would be, I think cities where you move and breathe, that does sound like a good idea, yeah? Even if you've never heard of climate change. But we have to move fast. So I've made the story deliberately. It is important. It's a very attractive story. But it does involve moving very quickly. Now, I have not got the time to go into all the bits and pieces of this report, but basically we look at the 5 areas at the bottom: energy, cities, food and land use, water and industry. They all matter. I'll say more here about cities than some of the others, but I don't want to lose, as it were, that broad sweep, because what I've already said, it tells us that we have to act everywhere. And what you've got here is 4 broad areas of action. Obviously, you've got to get the policies and the markets. This is going to be driven by private investment in large measure in well-functioning markets. So we can do something to help markets function better. That's that the markets reflect through the prices in them the scarcities and the costs associated with what people do. and pricing carbon, stopping subsidising fossil fuels, being transparent about what you do is all part of the policy. Sustainable infrastructure at the core, roughly 70% of emissions associated with infrastructure one way or the other, and 70% of the extra infrastructure will be in Asia in the coming years. I mean, 0.7 times 0.7 is ballpark a half. So this story is in large measure shaped by infrastructure in Asia. So I don't want to put too many burdens on your back, but it's you people, what you do is at the heart of this whole story. The last point, let me just spend a moment on that. I've emphasized rapid, radical change. That will mean that there will be some dislocation. Some people have to move out of one activity into another activity. Lots of people have been moving out of manufacturing into services because that's the way in which economies change. It's the way that preferences drive what is produced as incomes rise. We've seen labour-saving technical progress in many parts of the world. I mean, think of what happens to retail. We've seen globalisation. We've seen the global financial crisis. 4 very big pushes for change. And then along comes these people who want us to move to the low zero carbon economy, another one. Well, the answer is that we just have to get much better at managing this kind of change. And we've not been good at it in the rich world. It's coming very intensively in China now. China, you know, you could change the balance in China by one sector growing very fast and another sector not growing very fast, and the balance changes. Now we've got a story in China. Some sectors are going to reduce. Steel and cement are going to reduce in China. Coal is going to reduce in China. That's the story. So you're going to have to manage that change, and it's coming quickly. So it's very important that countries, particularly China, because it's so big and where this is so important, that it's very important that China does much better than we've done in the rich countries in managing this kind of change. We've seen the deep political reaction in the northern parts of the UK, the old manufacturing towns. We've seen the deep political reaction in the corresponding cities and the rust belts of the United States. Managing this change is a key part of this whole policy story. I'll just say a little bit now about the conditions. I've already mentioned the carbon price, the centrality of sustainable infrastructure. And let me underline one thing. You know, prices have to indicate cost. So I hope I don't, for this group, have to rehearse the importance of a carbon price and not subsidising fossil fuels. But there's something more than in public policy. Having broadly sound policies is one thing. They've got to be credible over lifetimes of investment. Government-induced policy risk is the biggest deterrent of investment, whether it's blue, tartan, green, whatever. Government-induced policy risk. Governments have to be plausible. They have to be credible because people are trying to respond to those signals, and they're trying to make long-term commitments in response to those signals. So the language I often use is that the government has to be predictably flexible. We will learn. Circumstances change. And indeed, one of the points of doing all this is to learn because there's so much discovery out there. But governments have to be predictably flexible. They have to say, as we encourage this industry, we might start with a subsidy. As we encourage this industry, as it plays through, as the diffusion is much bigger, as the costs come down, then we will reduce the subsidy, roughly like this. It doesn't have to be perfect. But what has happened in big parts of Europe is you've had tremendously successful support for solar and wind, and then the government says, my goodness, that's happened very quickly, we're paying out quite a lot for this, and you suddenly turn it off. And then you expect people to believe you next time you try to have an incentive in some direction or other. So being predictably flexible is very important. Also, a carbon price doesn't redesign a city. Never stop repeating how important a carbon price is, but it doesn't redesign a city. And you're going to have to think of ways of making that happen. And in order to do that, you're going to have property taxation, because you have to need the revenue to invest and do things differently. So these are quite complex systems. But we, as we talk about getting prices to give the right signals, we must add predictably flexible credibility, and we must add the importance of design, the importance of transparency, the importance of some kind of regulation. So I've got a bit here, which again I'm picking things up and emphasizing them, although there's much more in the report. Resilience is extremely important. I just want to spend one moment talking about resilience, because most of the time I'm talking about mitigation and reducing the emissions. But basically, we know that a lot of climate change is going to come. We're already seeing pretty hard effects on 1 degree. And we know that 1.5 is very likely, even though we try very hard. And indeed, it's quite likely that we'll get to 2. I mean, if we got to 2, that would be a failure on the Paris Agreement. But you've got to anticipate that this might be the outcome. And this can be tough. I mean, already on 1 degree, we're seeing very nasty things. I mean, you see very serious typhoons here. But the difference between 0 and 1 is going to look small relative to the difference between 1 and 2. On just the difference between 1.5 and 2, we've seen underlined in this last month with the 1.5 degree report. All the coral reefs are gone at 2. You might have 25% of them left at 1.5. That's a very big, important change. The Arctic cover would be in place. You might have a completely ice-free Arctic 1 year in 100 on 1.5. There'd be one every decade on 2. Big effects on fisheries, on the difference between 1.5 and 2. So that report is actually a very timely reminder that the Paris target of well below 2 degrees was a wise target, and that 2 degrees is too high. So we have to think constantly about resilience. And one thing I'd like to emphasize more as time goes by is the importance of the natural infrastructure in resilience. Now, sustainability is leaving at least as good opportunities to the next generation as you had, assuming that they behave in the same way to those that follow. That's the formal definition of sustainability. That depends on what you leave to the next generation. What do you leave? Well, you leave various forms of capital: physical capital, human capital, meaning health and education; natural capital, meaning in large measure, our forests and our oceans and how they function; and social capital, which is the social cohesion, the way in which communities are able to work together, the quality of governance. That's what you give. And what we're learning now is that where we used to concentrate on physical capital, we started to learn that human capital is important too. Education and health certainly are about opportunities. But we've learned much more now about the importance of natural capital and social capital. And that's exactly what we were talking about in Beijing last Monday morning. If you want to have high quality, strong, sustainable growth, you've got to think of all those 4 capitals. I mean, the mangroves and the corals are great protection against storm surges. That's natural capital, giving you your sea protection. The forests determine watersheds. The forests determine avalanches and mudslides and so on. The looking after our oceans and our forests are absolutely fundamental to our resilience, but not just our resilience, our whole productivity as a whole. The story, of course, goes beyond the natural capital, but I did want to spend a moment because it's so bound up with the resilience story. But the story of capital now will be in large measure a story of the combination between public action and private monies. The infrastructure is sort of ballpark 3 trillion, 2.5, 3 trillion a year infrastructure investment. That will be rising over the next 15, 20 years to 8 or 9 trillion a year. And all of that essentially has to be sustainable. So a lot of this story is not necessarily new quantitative investment, although we'll need a bit more. It's the quality of investment and what the nature of that infrastructure is. If you think of that 2.5, 3 trillion rising to 8, 9 trillion a year dollars on infrastructure investment, sustainable infrastructure investment, because all of it has to be sustainable, the public sector can't be everywhere on that. It simply can't. It won't have the resources to do that. So you've got to have some way in which public and private sector work together. Now, the public sector will be enormously important in setting the policy and institutional environment along the lines I've just described. Only the beginnings of a description, but they also have to be very good at blending together the finance in the right kind of way. Now, I've been for 10 years of my life the chief economist, first of the EBRD and then of the World Bank. So I tend to think that they have something to offer. I didn't leave in disgust. I learned a lot along the way and feel rather positive towards those institutions. And essentially, they do things that the private sector can't do. They've got a shareholder structure that is looking to take the very long term. They've got ability to carry different kinds of risk. They can give equity, long-term finance, political risk guarantees. So what you want the MDBs, multilateral development, and the national development banks, not just the multilateral development banks, what you want them to do is to take the risks that the private sector can't take. And that way, and particularly in the early first 3, 4, 5 years of infrastructure projects. Then this great pool of private sector money, which finds it difficult to come in, it then can come in. The MDBs can sell on their loans and their equities and so on. The need for the guarantees would go away. If the private sector has confidence in the MDBs, they can come in even earlier than that. But it's blending is about managing, sharing, allocating risk. It's not just thinking of a number, look, I'm in for 10% and you're in for 90%. How it works is through the management of risk. Now, if you do all these things, there's a little diagram here. The older I get, the less I believe in models. But essentially, you've got to try to pick up, try to be a little bit structured about what all this might lead. And we did try. We did try to do that. And the kind of growth path we've described really quite soon gives very strong results. I mean, you've got 65 million or so jobs around the world. I think that's the workforce of the UK and Egypt combined. That's extra jobs. The total sum of all the benefits that you'd get, just in terms of narrow output measures, would be around 26 trillion. I actually believe that the models we've used, for various reasons, grossly underestimate the likely benefits of all this. 26 trillion is roughly a sort of third of current GDP, so the accumulated benefit of 26 trillion is a lot. And as I said, I think that's an underestimate of the story. I'll have to accelerate now, but let me, because we're already running short of time. But if you look and do the emissions growth in the world, Chinese cities are going to be half the city's growth in emissions, and the city's growth in emissions is by far the biggest part of the world's growth of emissions. You keep coming back to the centrality of China, just quantitatively, in this whole story. Now, I said I'd concentrate on China and cities. Here, it's really quite an interesting diagram here. It's from World Bank data. But you can see, if you look out on the right side, and the blue is the rest of the world, and the yellow is China. So China's cities are more dense than the rest of the world's cities at low levels of city size. But for high levels of city size, China's cities are much less dense than the world's cities. Now, that's a way of illustrating that China's cities have grown through sprawl. As their population goes up very strongly, their population density goes down. So you've got cities, the area covered by cities is going up faster than the population. So that is a very, very inefficient way of growing. Now, I'm going to do it this way, so you have to take a little risk. But is there anybody here from Atlanta? One person, okay. You're going to have to excuse me, but you'll see why I asked in a moment. Now, is anybody here from Barcelona? No. But most of you have been, many of you have been to Barcelona, you understand, or some other nice European city, call it in Italy or Spain. Now, those are much more compact. The reason we picked Atlanta and Barcelona is that they've got roughly the same population and roughly the same income per capita. But Atlanta is right spread out, and its emissions are a factor of 5, 6, 7 of the emissions of Barcelona, even though the income per capita is similar and the population is similar. And then you can see the end of this little digression. You say, how many of you would prefer to live in Barcelona relative to Atlanta? So, I mean, it's a way of making the point that as our cities grow so quickly, how they grow is going to be fundamental. We've seen the city is the most important part of the growth. We've seen that China is the most important growth when you look at cities. How Chinese cities grow is going to be extremely important to this whole question. Some of that's about public finance, because China, not only China, but in China, land is sold on the margin to keep the public finances going, and you can see how that contributes to sprawl. So it's a slightly funny thing to say, but a good system of property taxation in China is one of the keys to this story. I just leant on the computer. Anyway, having said something about the problems of Chinese cities, this is underlining the congestion issues, particularly bad in China. So China is particularly bad on sprawl in the big cities, it's particularly bad on congestion in the big cities, and it's particularly bad on pollution in the big cities. So cutting down the congestion and cutting down the pollution be very big gains from going down the route that we are trying to talk about here. Having pointed out the difficulties in China's cities, short bit of cheerfulness, there are actually Chinese cities that are doing much better than the others. So I think it's a very important part of the story. And I think this source is from C4 Cities work. I think, Robert, you might say something a little more about that, so I won't dwell on it. Now, China is moving very quickly. I've already said that China's emissions are plateauing. Coal use probably peaked in 2014. There'll be little sort of ups and downs, but it is a very important part of the story. Liu He, who sort of leading on the Chinese economy, is very seized on these issues. There's a little sort of slightly China-oriented statistic counting the references to environment and green in President Xi's speech to the 19th Party Conference. Environment and green occurred 89 times, and the economy occurred 70 times. So as a little statistical signal of emphasis in the story, the eco-civilization story, the quality of growth is deep, deep now in the Chinese policy system, and it's tremendous that it is, and it's very thoughtfully there as well in my view. So that's China's emissions. If you like to be really optimistic about the way in which international discussion affects what happens, the 2009-10 was COP15 and COP16 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Copenhagen and the following year Cancun coincided roughly with the beginning of the 12th five-year plan. So you can see that public discussion and the 12th plan was associated with a slowing down in the rise of China's emissions. Then we moved to COP21 and the Paris Agreement, 2015, and the 13th five-year plan period, and you can see that the plateau begins. So you have to be careful about cause and effect. China's commitment to the issues around climate change was a key factor in shaping the Paris Agreement. So I don't want to tell you that the Paris Agreement caused the plateau in Chinese emissions. Both happened in the same time for good reason. It was a changing commitment of China. 14th five-year plan, strong prospects of decrease. This is the public discussion that we need to have. I'm engaging. I've been working in China for 30 years now with lots of friends in the economic side, and many of you have been working in China for much longer than that. But this is the time to think through, to collaborate, analyze, work together, show what's possible. So I've already mentioned the idea of human, social, physical capital and natural capital, and that is going to obviously be a key part of the story. And I've raised the story of the new growth model. The Chinese reforms are going to be a very important part of that story. I've essentially covered that rather carefully. The Belt and Road Initiative will be very important, and this here is an illustration of just how important the Belt and Road countries are. And a little bit of mental arithmetic makes it very clear how important the Belt and Road countries are. They are roughly, it depends how you count them, and they're different sort of lists, but 65, 70, and with a population maybe 3 times that of China. And an income per capita, half China. So you can think, it's a slightly sort of simplistic version, but you can see what I mean. You've got 3 more Chinas of 15 years ago out there. They're currently half the income per capita of China. And they're roughly 3 lots in terms of population. And that's China 15 or 20 years ago, half the income per capita. If those 3 Chinas of 15 or 20 years ago become like China now in 20 years' time in terms of emissions, forget 3 degrees. Yeah? So that little bit of arithmetic just tells you how important, you've got to follow the numbers, how important the Belt and Road countries are. So the 14th five-year plan and the growth patterns in the Belt and Road countries are what shapes the future. And of course, particularly the cities in that story. So this is the part of the world, the cities, and how that process of change happens over this next 20 years. This is what shapes the future of the planet. So it's very exciting actually to be here, but you feel a bit responsible as well. So I've told you the story of the next importance of the next 10 or 20 years, that it is the growth story. This is just summarizing the points that I've made. I want to end a little bit on an optimistic note, and I want to do that. It's kind of anxious optimism. My father taught me that you could be both anxious and happy at the same time. It's not always easy, but it can be done. So you can see how big the challenge is. You can see that we have to act together. We have to create the political will. We have to collaborate across the nation. C40 is one example of how you do that. And I just want to end by saying, well, let's just take one part of the story of how we might collaborate together, how we might make this happen. And why don't we do it on finance, since that's where we are. So the first thing you have to do on the finance is to calibrate. What is in the activities that you're financing in terms of emissions? Yeah? If you're trying to push in a certain direction, well, what's actually happening? Who is it? What sort of activities are you going for? And that calibration, I think, will be extremely important, and it will be around sustainability. I don't often wear badges, but this is the Sustainable Development Goals. So one way of calibrating sustainability is to take the Sustainable Development Goals and ask, how is this activity contributing to those? Of course, low carbon is a big part and runs right through that whole story. And I had at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum had a very good discussion with Noel Quint. Noel's not here, is he, today? Oh, of HSBC, yeah? He was thinking very thoughtfully and structured way about looking at supply chains. So when you fund a firm and its activities, it's not just that firm, it's the supply chain for that firm. So good bankers know their customers. First rule of banking, right? Well, know your customers, know their supply chains. So this story will be of calibration, but not just firm by firm. It'll be supply chain by supply chain. So get to know what you're doing. And you can probably do that quite quickly, actually. If you do know your clients, and HSBC is such a good bank, they always know their clients. The second is transparency. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which was initiated by Mark Carney in his capacity as chair of the Financial Stability Board, and carried through by a team led by Mike Bloomberg, has a very good structured way of reporting on financial disclosure. I mean, if I have a pension, I want to know whether that company managing my money is investing in the technologies of the 19th century, which are very risky, or investing in the technologies of the 21st century, which might give me a good pension. I have a right to know that. So it's very important that that disclosure is there. And we know that if you calibrate well and you disclose, just that itself can have a big effect on behavior. Good examples are very important. We now know that people who behave responsibly in safety and in working conditions, in carbon emissions and so on, people who behave responsibly actually do better. Though if they behave in that way, they're more likely to make profits. I've got my good friend of mine, John Kay, who has written quite extensively on people who are driven to do something, make some great new product and behave responsibly as they do, tend to make more money. And the way he puts it is that breathing is necessary for life, but breathing is not the purpose of life. And if you think about profits in the same way, I think it's quite helpful. And essentially, firms got to make profits to keep going. Firms have got to make profits to repay their loans to HSBC. This matters. But actually what we're seeing is that the more responsible behavior, the more money you make. And it's not surprising. It really isn't surprising. If you found out that the guy looking after your money had been caught drunk driving, wouldn't you worry? I mean, people who take risks, he might be doing that with a pension fund that they're looking after. But it's not just that. It's also, of course, they may be investing in industries where they've just mistakenly judged the future. And we now know that the high carbon industries or related don't have a very good future. So he might be irresponsible, might just be mistaken in terms of investment strategies. But there's more than that. My great friend Paul Polman, who's the chief executive of Unilever, co-chair of this commission, and by the way, Stephen Green, the former chair of HSBC, and John Flint, the current CEO, they're both commissioners of the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. But if just take Paul and Unilever, they get 1.8 million job applications a year. 1.8 million. The best people want to go to work for these kinds of firms. If they get the best people, they've probably got a very good future. Customers, I mean, you don't want to buy a carpet made by child labour. You want to know whether it is or not. You'd rather take your custom elsewhere. If they won't tell you whether or not it's made by child labour, then maybe you better go elsewhere anyway. So in terms of the right kind of workers and workforce and who you attract, in terms of not taking unnecessary or stupid risks, in terms of good relationships with your customer, this is a really good business story. This is the growth story, the business story of the 21st century. When I talk to undergraduates often come, or not just undergraduates, they, all right, I hear you, Professor Stern, so what do I do? And I try to give a list of things that they can do. And it's essentially the big things in terms of what they produce and consume. Food, transport, energy, housing. You can change your diet. You don't have to be a vegetarian. I'm not a vegetarian, but I eat less meat, at least red meat, as time goes by. I actually feel better for it too. But you have to think about what you're doing. Transport, use public transport. I mean, it makes such a big difference. All the energy I buy is from Good Energy, a tremendous wind farm company in the UK. They give you better services. They answer the telephone if you ring them up. And they're a good company. And you don't have to buy high. And of course, the energy that's related to high carbon is going to be the most expensive energy as time goes by, particularly if we have, as we should, a carbon price. Efficient housing. Pensions. Again, excuse me if I use an HSBC example. Your defined contribution scheme has the default option, the Legal and General Investment Management Future Fund. For transparency, I advise an advisor on that future fund. But that's the default option. And that's a very powerful story. The more people who tick a default option, the more people who are offered a default option that is a sustainable option, the better. It really starts to move the money. And of course, they have a safer pension too, and a better pension as a result. And finally, of course, politics. Vote and campaign, because politicians will be a big, not the only part, I've emphasised the business part, the personal part. Politicians are a big part of the story because the policies we set can have a big part to play in what happens. So thank you very much.